I would be someone who didn't get politics from above. You know, and by saying that I mean at university or reading books. I got interested in politics. I suppose I joined the Northern Ireland Labour Party, the Derry Labour Party, which was associated with the Northern Ireland Labour Party. The Northern Ireland Labour Party in turn being associated with the British Labour Party. And we had a very good Derry Labour Party. It was called the Londonderry Labour Party, and it was very well attended. It was very vibrant. It was very busy. It was full of people, full of commitment about Derry and about politics. There was a sort of liberal people in it, and there was left people in it like myself and Willie Breslin, Charlie Morrison, Brendan Hines, and it was the left in it were fairly radical, you know, in terms of what they said and things they did. And the Derry Labour Party was also, Ivan Cooper was also in it. Ivan was a very vibrant member of it. He was probably the most well-known member of it because his background was very interesting. He was very concerned about housing in Derry and very concerned basically about Derry and the politics of it. He was born in Killaloe, as you know, being a Protestant, used to be associated with the Unionist Party in some way or another. But I met Ivan way back when we were very young, when we were about 13 years of age. And I lived in Wellington Street in the Bogside, just beside Free Derry Corner. And Ivan and I would have played for the same football team, so we spent a lot of time on the Bogside and people got to know him. He was very outspoken. He was a very honest fellow, and he talked about housing, and he was a very public-faced man, you know. And so that's when I got to know Ivan. So Ivan was also in the Derry Labour Party, and that was, I think, the Derry Labour Party was going on from about 1963-64. But I lived in number 7 Wellington Street down the bog, beside Free Derry Corner, 100 yards from Free Derry Corner. My father was a cattle drover. I'm telling you this because that's why I got into politics, or interested in politics. And my father was a cattle drover, worked very hard. Myself, my mother, my 2 sisters, for us. He suffered bronchitis all his life. The house that we lived in was awful state, damp. If you touched the wallpaper, you got an electric shock, you know. Of course, like everyone else in the town, we kept hoping all the time we would get a house, but there was no houses built at that time. My father would have worked with a man called Dr. Abernethy. My father was very good with animals. He would have looked after some of Abernethy's animals. He got on well with animals. And Dr. Abernethy thought the world of him. Now, interestingly, Dr. Abernethy was the medical officer of health in Derry. He was also in charge of the apprentice boys in Derry. A big named unionist, a big unionist man in the town. And when my father died at 54 years of age, that was about 1963. The first person to come to my home was Dr. Abernethy. And interestingly, the second person to come was Ivan. But my father died, yeah, and it was shocking, like it is for anyone. And I remember thinking that living in that house all those years didn't do him a lot of good because of his bronchitis and his general bad health. And I got very, very angry at the thought of it. And I remember when Dr. Abernethy came to the house, he came in and he sat down, my mother, we had tea, etc. And then he was leaving, we all left him to the door, as you did in those days. Family left the visitor to the door. He said to my mother, Mrs. Clenaghan, I'll get you a house now. And my mother said to him, but your Dr. Abernethy, it's too late, Jimmy's dead. I've never forgotten that, you know. And I remember being very, very angry about it, you know, and it never left me, that moment. And that's why I got involved in politics. It's no big deal, that was the reason. That's what I meant by saying that I got politics from my surroundings rather than from above, you know. And I was at that time they were redeveloping, and then a few years later they started redeveloping the Bogside Redevelopment area, which of course the redevelopment was associated with the fact that they didn't want to extend the boundaries because that would have interfered with the voting pattern, which was very unfair and gerrymandered in Derry. So they were building upwards, as the high flats evidenced by the high flats. And I believe a lot of people don't realise that at that time there was plans to build high flats over around the Brandywell area and a lot around the Lone Moor area. It never materialised that because of the troubles. But I was very upset at that time between one thing and another, and I was a member of the Labour Party, the good party at that time. And I would complain about the condition of the Bogside around Wellington Street, where there was walls that were half knocked down, half built, children were falling off them, etc. And I would complain about this all the time, about the state of the place, to the extent that I used to block streets, and would block streets and would do this. At the same time I was always advocating for someone who was looking for houses. So I'd be never out of the housing executive office. There was one at the top of Fawn Street at the time, and I was in and out of that practically daily.
Were you part of a group? Was that part of a group? Was that the Derry Housing Action Committee?
No, that was before that. This was just part of the Derry Labour Party.
Right.
And I was agitating right, left and centre. And that was during and then the Derry Housing Action Committee sprung up along with the Derry Unemployed Action Committee. So there was three sort of radical entities in Derry at that time. There was the Derry Labour, after the Derry Labour Party, the Housing Action Committee, and the Derry Unemployed Committee. And we had a lot in common because of what we were doing. And in March 1963. March 1968, Eamon McCann came back from London, and Eamon came in to see me, and we chatted, and he writes this in that book you mentioned, but he said in the book he only came over for his sister's wedding, I think, but I asked him to go to a meeting at the weekend, and he stayed for it. And when Eamon arrived, he joined the Derry Labour Party because that was the only place for him, really. And he influenced great change. He had an urgency about him that no one else had. He had an urgency about him. He had an internationalist perspective, and as I've written in that article we talked about, he sort of dislodged the sort of liberals in the Derry Labour Party, made them feel uncomfortable. He was just, I suppose, to some extent, in a sort of thinking in modern terms about left-wing politics, etc. He's also a Trotskyist. He had also been very much involved in the anti-Vietnam movement in London. He was very prominent in that, very articulate and very, very urgent, wanted things done immediately. And had a tremendous influence in that whole sort of radical scene in Derry, And as I said, the Housing Action Committee, the Derry left the Labour Party, and the Unemployed Action Committee. We would get together and do some demonstrations together. That became a very radical movement in the town, and to the extent that it sidelined constitutional politics, like the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party had been the sort of people in Derry who were speaking up for the city, and speaking up about nationalism, about discrimination, about the lack of housing, about the lack of jobs, but they weren't doing it in a radical way. It was more sort of talk rather than action. And Eddie McAteer, who they formed the official opposition against the Unionists at Stormont at one stage. Eddie McAteer was a very good man, but very conservative in ways. He wasn't a very radical person in terms of action. Nevertheless, he was very well respected. But the prominent members of that radical group, like McCann and myself and Eamon Malloch and Van Barrow Doherty, and just before that sort of period also, I would have squatted a lot of people into houses. I actually had my own housing list, and Woolley Breslin or somebody would phone me up, or Charlie Morris, and say there's an empty house in such and such a street, and immediately I would go and get a family and move them in. And we would have sort of handyman with us and a plumber or whatever we needed to get the people settled. I made a few mistakes, mind you, because I put people in houses that weren't really vacated, but that was what happened sometimes, to my embarrassment. But that was the sort of activity we were doing, and we, Charlie Morrison and Woolley and I, we had a all we needed to put someone in a house, to fix it up, etc. But anyway, and that was the sort of activity that was going on, and constitutional politics were completely and totally sidelined, and because we were actually taking direct action. That was the difference, wasn't it? We were taking direct action. If we didn't like something, we did something about it. Whereas, constitutional politics discussed it, brought it up at meetings, took it, etc.
You were more immediate?
We were more immediate, that's right. And that was the sort of stuff we were at, And I remember then we were causing a lot of disruption in the town. There's so much to talk about in those days when you think about it, about squatting, and we were forming tenants associations also. We were getting ordinary people involved in their political life, in politics. It was we were busy as bees, and McCann once, and there was people in the Guildhall, families in the Guildhall occupying the Guildhalls and that for protesting about housing. And Eamon and Malloch, I remember Eamon Malloch saying to Eamon McCann, yeah, well, I'll phone up the housing, the civil rights people in the morning, and we'll arrange a march, see if they'll arrange a civil rights march for Derry. And that's why the 5th of October happened. A lot of people were very dubious about the 5th of October march because it was organised by the radical element, And you may be radical and responsible, but nevertheless, there's a large number of people who think if you're radical that you're irresponsible by definition, And that there's a certain amount of truth in that, but irresponsibility in that sense is probably initiative. And what happened the 5th of October, the state arrived and under the Bill Craig ordered the police in, and we were beaten into the ground, basically. You've seen footage of it, I suppose. We were beaten into the ground, but that wasn't just a reflection of what the police felt should have been done that day. It was really sort of beating nationalists back into their place, and that's what that was about, just remember who you are, sort of thing, because the Northern Ireland, by its very nature and the nature of the state, means if you do anything, you're either anti-Protestant, if you do anything to help, you're anti-Protestant. You're defined as anti-Protestant. That's because of the nature of the state. And of course, as well as I do, this is nonsense, But the 5th of October happened, and I remember Eamon and I coming back. I remember John Hume and I lifting the injured into Cassoni's Cafe, which was just at the end of the bridge there, and putting them in tables until the ambulances arrived for them. But I remember even McCann and I coming back into the Bogside, and there was a riot at the top of Fawn Street. This was something we hadn't seen before. It's not, I certainly hadn't seen anything like it before. It was remarkable. And this, of course, was the culmination of the way people felt over time. It just wasn't because of the march or because of the violence. It had a lot to do with that, right enough, But I remember, and I mentioned before, when John Steinbeck actually came, he was a Nobel, literature for Nobel, prize winner, but he he was in the Bogside way back in 1952.
That's very interesting.
And he wrote for a magazine when he went back to America about that area. And he said there's going to be, I can't remember the exact words, but what he meant was that there's going to be trouble here soon. He just knew by looking at people, by looking at the area and by looking at people's faces. As I said in the thing, he knew something, these people felt that something had been stolen from them, and it's true. And, from my experience also living in Wellington Street, growing up, people just kept going to England to look for jobs. Job seeking just disintegrated the communities in Derry, and you could see all this, and this was all happening and building up over the years. But after the 5th of October March, I have to honestly say that I think that the radical group, who were desperate by definition before that, because they had all come together from different groups and they were a desperate group in that sense. And there was no common sort of philosophy to sort of pull them together, or that would have enabled them to have a philosophy about this or a strategy about that, or a plan to do this or do that or do the other thing. Gavin, so when the 5th of October happened, everything happened so quickly, and the situation turned so quickly that we felt it difficult to deal with. I certainly felt it difficult to deal with, because now it was sort of, you one day you were sort of having a march in Derry, the next day you were world news. And the press were coming from all around the place, from everywhere. And I certainly found it difficult to sort of cope with that and what we should do, etc., 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 etc. And at the risk of, I just think that a lot of people, a lot of the radicals at the time felt exactly the same way. They're sort of disarmed all of a sudden.
Prepared?
I think it was 3 or 4 days after the 5th of October then, there was a march called by, nobody knows who called it, there about 30 or 40, 50 people turned up at the City Hotel, John Hume and Michael Clenaghan, and people who were well known in the community, Stephen McGonigal, who was an independent Labour man for years and years and years, and who had fought elections in Derry against the Nationalists. And everybody sort of turned up. And we had this problem with that. What were we to do, Were we to ignore it, the radicals? Or were we... What were we to? We didn't quite know. But we did feel that all of a sudden people are arriving now to sort of associate themselves with us. And before that, many of them would have thought that what we were doing and the tactics that we employed were just totally foreign to them. They wouldn't have agreed with it. They would have said us, they're irresponsible, they're radicals, But now all of a sudden, Eamon McCann was very annoyed, I was very annoyed, everybody was annoyed, Willie Breslin. Johnny White was also very prominent at that time, and didn't quite know what to do. I had very mixed feelings about it. Eamon McCann was, that's when he came out with that phrase, they're all middle-aged, middle class and middle of the road. It's very understandable when you think about it, his anger and his pique, because I can certainly understand it, but nevertheless we didn't quite know what to do. Eamon sort of said what we should do is we should, okay, we'll agree to go to the meeting, but we will not have anything there to guide us or bind us to it. We'll talk about it afterwards. We did go to the meeting, and Eamon chaired it, and I was secretary, and Johnny White was the flanked Eamon on the other side, and there was a Citizens Action Committee elected, 16 people. I was elected. There was an understanding that the original organisers would be automatically put in, would be members of it. After the meeting, Eamon was very upset. A lot of people were upset. I was upset. Now, Eamon and I talked, and Willie Breslin and Charlie and Morrison and Johnny, everyone talked about this, and I was worried that, if we decided not to go into it, that we'd either be sort of accused of not understanding the gravity of the situation that was happening at that time, or that we were being elitist, or that we were huffing, or that we were, and that maybe people might have thought that what is needed is a very broad-based committee anyway, a larger broad-based committee. And let's face it, some of the people who were elected onto it, who proposed and elected onto it, were very well-known citizens and respected, forgive me for saying it, by the liberal classes, that sort of way. But I can understand, Eamon in particular, I can understand Eamon's anger at it, and Eamon was also thinking of politics, left-wing politics. He said if we don't associate ourselves with them, they won't have any legitimacy whatsoever. I wasn't sure about that. A lot of people weren't sure about it. I would have not sure about it at all, and given the fact that these were sort of well-known citizens, and unlike people like myself, who was the street radical, and then there was all sorts of arguments. One other person, somebody else would say, "Well, sure, we'll go in there and we'll try and influence it," But Eamon, very understandably, sort of disconnected himself from it. And that's the story of the origins of the Citizens Action Committee. And as I had written about before, when we went into the meetings, we found it very difficult to have any say whatsoever, because we were used sort of coming up with radical ideas. We were just responding to a situation that needed responding to immediately, and we could do that because we weren't an organised group. We didn't have to go through any protocol. We didn't have to have emotions and voting to do this. We just did it. I mean, I remember if I had heard that a resident was being treated badly by a landlord, I didn't have to go to a meeting to discuss this. I just went and sorted it out and got very angry and did what I had to do to sort it out, And there was many occasions when that happened. So sitting in the Citizens Action Committee with all this reasoned logic and reasonable approach and that, we had very little influence, But that's what happened at that time, and then the Citizens Action Committee, of course, had thousands and thousands of people on the street and marched here and marched there, which is part of history now, and were very powerful, And if you think about the legacy of the civil rights movement, and that after 1969, between 1969 and 1970, there was 3,500 houses built in Derry, If you look at what happened for it from 1969, January 1969 to August 1969, the Battle of the Bogside, there was a lot of reforms. The Derry Corporation was abolished, the Morton Commission took over, so democracy was restored to some extent with the corporation being abolished. William Craig was either sacked or resigned. I can't remember. I think he was sacked. The PD march started on the 1st of January, wasn't it? Yeah, the 1st of January 1969. Marched to Derry, and the situation with that was they were attacked everywhere they went, especially at Burntollet at the road here. And there was riots in Derry when they arrived from Derry. There was riots for 3 or 4 days after that, quite awful riots. And that's the time when the police come into the Bogside and abused people physically terribly, and beat people up and just wrecked houses, etc., etc. And all that is mounting up, and then Paisley was becoming very prominent at that time also, and Lord O'Neill, Terence O'Neill, was sort of seen as a liberal man. Any sort of small reforms that he tried to push through, Paisley would disagree, etc., etc. And so he resigned, and then Lord James Chichester Clark became. He was just a big countryman, a big went in with politics. And some of the statements he came out with were quite ridiculous. He was saying things like Catholics in Belfast are burning their own houses down,
You have a notion?
And at one stage, people from the Citizens Action Committee went up to meet him. He looked as if he just didn't understand what was happening at all, the seriousness of the situation. as I say, there was lots of reforms happening, and then the beef specials were also abolished at that time between Christmas and between New Year and August of '69. And lots of other things happened, and there were certain reform measures put in place, but it was all too little, too late, And then, of course, all those, and there was sort of, it was, I think, March in 1969, I think it was March, as far as I can remember, there were civil rights marches everywhere in the north of Ireland. There was about 20 civil rights marches in Derry. Everybody marched, dockers marched, factory girls marched, and the police could do absolutely nothing to stop it. It was, from their point of view, it was anarchical, it was just anarchy all in the streets. But people marched with pride and with discipline, and most of the time. So there was that. What was happening in '69? Then there was some reform measures got through, like I mentioned. There was but as I say, everything happened too late. Derry, for instance, as usual, got nothing. In terms of economic development or economic infrastructure, nothing like that happened in Derry. So there was always going to be that discontent in Derry.
Is that because it was nationalist?
Yes, nationalist.
In the book, you said fistless unionists conspired to do that, to make sure Derry got nothing.
Well, there was in 1967, wasn't it? 1968, the Derry Labour Party. 1967, the Derry Labour Party put up 16 candidates to fight local government elections, and actually got 1/3 of the vote, or just slightly less than 1/3 of the vote. But because of contrary arithmetic, they didn't get anybody in the council. But also in 1966, was it? I think I remember Ivan Cooper and I walking around the whole Waterside area with a petition, trying to get signatures to get the university to Derry, and of course, the Lockwood Committee for Adult Education, for further education, the university went to Clenaghan, which was ridiculous, and that was dreadful. That festered, in people in Derry and upset them very much. And if ever there was an ideal place for a university, I think Derry was that. And with its history and with its with the university, it could have been the embryo for the university, etc., all that stuff. But they never got the university, and that was very, very damaging. The people of Derry never forgiven.
No, I don't think people still annoys people.
Still, and even to this very day. I mean, they settled 2 years ago they were going to sort of expand Magee University. Still hasn't happened, and. I that's when I wrote that thing. I just felt that young people should know the experience of Derry. Not just young Catholic people or nationalist people, but young unionist people too should also realise what happened to Derry. I mean, the fact of the matter is, some unionists, the faceless men, actually voted or were against the university coming to Derry, just to sort of spite nationalism or Catholicism or whatever way they looked at the world, But it was unforgivable. It was unforgivable. And of course, at that time there was the big motorcade to Belfast, where 20,000 people went to Belfast, but no effect whatsoever because the mind was made up. I would have assumed that Lockwood was an Englishman. I don't know. I think the guy that was in charge of the Lockwood, and report on education, and that put the university in Coleraine, and. The influence on him must have been quite powerful in ways, but that was always the way. It's interesting too when you look back, talk about the effect of all this afterwards. What's the word you use?
Legacy.
Legacy, yeah. The civil rights movement, even to this very day, is affecting politics on the street here. It really does. It liberalised people's minds, nationalist people in the north of Ireland. It had a tremendous effect, that whole civil rights movement, in a sense. Now, interestingly enough, all civil rights was doing was looking for sort of citizenship rights, It wasn't sort of dealing with people's material conditions of existence in any sense, any sort of practical or theoretical sense at all. It was just looking for liberal rights, citizenship rights, and that's basically what it was about. So it was limited to that extent, But then civil rights movements are limited to that extent, or traditional movements about fighting for rights very limited, because it doesn't actually look at the holistic view of people's lives in terms of class and etc. etc. What else did it do? I mean, I think it had a great effect. It gave confidence. I think this, where I wouldn't be an expert on this at all, but I mean, I think it gave great confidence to organisations like Women's Liberation, like Gay Rights, all those organisations. It gave them confidence to fight for what they considered to be their rights, because really, in a sense, that's what the 60s was about too, internationally, in an internationalist perspective. And I think to this very day that the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland has had that effect on communities and on movements, radical movements, people that are looking for social change. I think it'd give them an inspiration, and give them a freedom, it'd give them an airing, it'd give them a belief in themselves, I think. Apart from the sort of material reforms and that which happened, but in that aesthetic way and in that abstract way, I think it had that effect too, Gavin. And I think it has to this very day. I mean, it's quite remarkable when you go to that Shea Gillespie Shah's photographs up there too. Shea Gillespie has organised the gay rights march in Derry every year, and the crowds that attend that are phenomenal, thousands of people, and the meeting in the Guildhall Square afterwards. It's remarkable. Derry is a bit remarkable like that, and I have to say this, and I think it should be said, I think Eamon McCann's personality, his abilities, his internationalism too, to some extent, has had a powerful effect in this town over the last 40 years, That is the truth. Yeah. One other thing which is very important is that there was a rule in the Citizens Action Committee that we were not formally political, Gavin. And I remember John Hume coming to me, John, saying we're thinking of putting Claude and myself and Ivan Cooper up to fight the election. And I remember saying, well, John, the rule was that we were not political formally and this, etc., etc., etc. But they stood for the elections. Ivan won mid-Derry, wasn't it? Yeah.
So they says they didn't want to make it political. Why did they make that decision?
Well, a lot of people would say it was opportunistic, and it certainly looks like it. They had got their name through the Citizens Action Committee, and a cause which was seen as a very noble cause, which is a good CV for anyone fighting an election. So people would have thought it was very opportunistic. I thought it was opportunistic. Yeah, I did. And I didn't maybe like the way the Citizens Action Committee was used as a launching pad.
For their
careers. For their political ambitions.
Just one more thing. You know the way you say history is written by the victors? Do you think it? When I was at school, I always thought we were being taught John Hume's version of the civil rights movement. Because he later went on to become Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
So I think I always thought John Hume was the only person.
Yeah.
And do you think that's?
I think inside his own political space, and the way he looks at the world, is a very decent fellow, John, and he's done a lot of good, inside his own political space, It's like Eddie McAteer, Eddie, when he was leader of the Nationalist Party and fought for years against unionism, inside his own politics, he was a wonderful man, but his politics wouldn't have been my politics, or John Hume's politics wouldn't have been my politics, with all the good work that John did, and Of course, yeah. History always takes a side, you know, because that's the liberal class that write the history books, whose books are listened to more or read more. The civil rights movement in the north of Ireland emanated directly from street radical activity from the likes of McCann, Willie Breslin, Charlie Morrison, Brennan Hines, Cathy Harkin, and lots of other, and Mrs. Bond and her husband Johnny Bond. Those were the street radicals. The civil rights movement, they started the civil rights movement. It was them that challenged the state and started the civil rights movement. Myself, Eamon the Lock, Finborough Doherty, all those people. And I must say Ivan Cooper to a large extent too, because Ivan always worked hard and showed a lot of courage in his politics too, you know. But it was the radicals that were the civil rights movement, that provided the launching pad for the civil rights movement, you know. And the truth of the matter is, of course, that a lot of people in the Citizens Action Committee would not have been stuck in the street and pulling caravans across the street, etc., and breaking houses, breaking windows in houses to put families in. And that's the sort of stuff that was done. And that's what built the political consciousness in this town. And that's what created the space for courage from people to do things that were the right thing to do. But we're not seen, it may have been 10 years before that, seen as very, very, very unacceptable. I wouldn't be a man for being very certain about anything, you know. I have to think about things a lot. Nothing comes easy you know. But apart from that, again, there are things which you know is right and there's things which you know is wrong, you know. And I know for a fact that the radical class in Derry, when they went on the street during the 60s, or late, you know, before 68, we did the right thing. They were great. And I know that the left wing of the old Derry Labour Party were very important too, you know. And there's a continuum between the two, you know. You know, yeah.
Are you happy enough for what you said? Do you want to say anything else?
No, I just, well, I mean, you know, I just sort of, the nature of the Northern Ireland state, you know, determined the way a lot over the years, you know, because it was, from the moment it began in 1921, 22, it was looking over its shoulder, you know. And one of the greatest enemies it has is modernity. You know, as you can see when it talks about gay rights and women's rights, etc., it congeals into a fierce fear, you know. It just can't deal with modernity at all, you know.
The state in the north?
In the north, yeah.